As the San Francisco music scene took shape with the success of bands like Jefferson Airplane, Big Brother and the Holding Company, and the Grateful Dead, one new band threatened to top them all, and that was Moby Grape. We're going to hear about their history here on Pop Goes the 60s.
Turn away and wait, I just delay. Hey Grandma, you're so young. Come on, sweet on you.
The growing legend of Moby Grape comes from two main areas, the first being the brilliant debut album, and the second one is that of Mismanagement, which combines into a hard-luck story of unfulfilled potential. I'm going to give you some perspective on some of the events leading up to this history, where the myth unfortunately sometimes outshines the music. During the rise of the San Francisco sound, record companies were scrambling to sign new bands, and several were signed in 1966, like the Grateful Dead, Big Brother and the Holding Company, Country Joe and the Fish, and Sopwith Camel. The formation of Moby Grape resulted from some of the cast-offs of Jefferson Airplane, the first person being Skip Spence. He was the original Airplane drummer, and he played on the first album and even wrote 2 songs. Prior to being in the Jefferson Airplane, he was in several folk bands, and including, for a brief time, the Quicksilver Messenger Service. And Spence was not really a drummer at heart. He was more of a guitarist-songwriter, and he got relieved of his duties with the Airplane, taking a trip to Mexico without really telling the others, and he missed, I think, some rehearsals or gigs, whichever you believe, and he was thrown out of the band. But I have a feeling that he wanted to get kicked out of the band to start something new. So now the original manager of the Jefferson Airplane, Matthew Cates, also was fired, and those two decided to form a new band. Cates realized Spence had potential and formed a band around his talents. This was in the summer of 1966, and other members of the Grape included Peter Lewis. He was a guitarist who was originally in a band called the Cornells, and he is the son of actress Loretta Young. Bob Mosley, who was from San Diego, in a band called the Misfits. He ended up joining a band called the Frantics, which also had 2 guys named Don Stevenson and Jerry Miller in them. Now, Miller had toured with the Bobby Fuller 4 and had crossed paths with the young Jimi Hendrix. Meanwhile, Don Stevenson had held the beat for shouters like Etta James and Big Mama Thornton. And the Frantics cut one very good single in early '66. Now, the Frantics, Misfits, and Cornells, all those bands had been around for a while. These guys were quite professional and had paid their dues. So that song you just heard was a Miller and Stevenson original and a pretty good song. And we're going to revisit the B-side of that song later in the Moby Grape's history. And Matthew Cates started to gather these players together, and everything fell into place rather quickly. And the name of the band came from the punchline of a joke, which was what's big and purple and lives in the ocean, Moby Grape. Not the best name, but that's what they went with. For those of you who watch my series on Jefferson Airplane know all about Matthew Cates. And yes, his name is pronounced Cates and not Cats, even though Cats is a more normal way to pronounce it. He pronounced it Cates, and everybody around him to this day still pronounces it Cates. So we're going to go with that pronunciation. Now, early rehearsals of the band, these guys just really clicked. Some of the guys had already been playing together, but Lewis and Spence were basically the newcomers to the former Frantics, and they just all fell in beautifully and were really excited about the sound that they heard from themselves. Unlike the other San Francisco bands who came from a background of folk, blues, and bluegrass, Moby Grape's players basically had rock and roll roots, so they had a different sound right off the bat and a different approach to music as well, and it was immediately different from the rest of the bands on the scene. Because of their rock and roll background, they were basically a guitar band, and their songs were constructed as short, powerful rock songs. And they had 5 singers in this band, and there was really no frontman, and 3 very good guitar players, Jerry Miller being the lead guy. Unlike Jefferson Airplane, where Grace Slick and Paul Kantner tried to not smile while they were playing live, Moby Grape couldn't help but smile when they were playing live because they were having so much fun. Moby Grape's first gig was at California Hall in front of a reported 5 people. Now, they started playing and rehearsing at a place called the Ark, which was a houseboat turned club, and they shared the bill with the likes of Buffalo Springfield. Now, predictably, there were record labels all over Buffalo Springfield and Moby Grape trying to sign them. And where Moby Grape was concerned, several labels like Elektra, Kama Sutra, and Atlantic all threw their hat in the ring. But Columbia ended up winning out. And one of their producers, a young guy named David Rubinson, really took a shine to Moby Grape and really wanted to work with them. Now, in October of 1966, the band had already signed a management contract with Matthew Cates. But when this new deal came up with Columbia, Cates coerce them or con them into signing over all the publishing, including the use of the name of the band, to him, because he said that otherwise Columbia wouldn't sign them. So he basically lied to them and got them to give away all the things that make money, essentially. And Mosley said, we were just young, stupid guys, and they were just looking to get this deal done and to move on, and they trusted Matthew Cates. He was like a father figure to them, and at first Cates really seemed to have their best interests at heart. Now, Cates pulled the same type of arrangement with Jefferson Airplane, which is what got him fired ultimately. And what's interesting to me is that Skip Spence, who also came from the Airplane, who got screwed by Cates in that band, essentially didn't say anything with regard to the signing of the Moby Grape contract. I don't know this addendum that was added, if Spence understood it, or it seemed to me he would have raised some kind of a red flag, but he didn't. And the band trusted Cates, and Cates threatened to kill the deal with Columbia unless they signed this addendum. Now, in some of the early days, the band wasn't playing much and didn't have a lot of money to live on, and Peter Lewis, I think, helped the other guys out a little bit. He had a little more affluent background, so he helped keep the band afloat a little bit, just living expenses and things before they started to make some more money touring once they got Cates on board. Now, in early 1967, Moby Grape went down to Los Angeles to record their debut album, and it was helmed by David Rubinson, producer, and it was made in about 2 weeks. The band showed up very well prepared, they were well rehearsed, and they knew all of their parts. One thing that makes this album stand out right from the get-go is the energy it brings. And the background that they brought was basically a blues, rock, some folk, some honky-tonk, and pop. So they had quite a variety, 5 different singers, so they had a varied sound. Everybody contributed something. Now, the title for the song, Omaha, was just an off-the-cuff remark made by writer Skip Spence. The song probably should have been called Listen My Friend, which is what everybody refers to it as, because Omaha is not in the lyric. Now, because of their different styles and their backgrounds, the 3 guitarists brought all these different sounds, and it was a very unique way that the guitars meshed, and they stood apart from one another. So this was called, within Moby Grape circles, this is called crosstalk. So the guitars really standing out a lot and playing off one another brilliantly.
Upside down, upside down. Sure looking good. You're looking so good. You're sure looking good. What is this feeling my heart gets when I see you smile?
The guitar playing of Moby Grape is one of the things that set them apart from the other San Francisco bands. And Buffalo Springfield had a similar setup. They were LA, and they were probably the only comparable band to Moby Grape at the time.
But just the same, I'm playing my game, and I guess you're playing it too. Stay with me now tomorrow. Come on, baby,
Those 3 songs show their pop sensibilities, while these next 3 show their country and folk leanings.
Can I pop fireworks on the 4th of July? Ain't no use in saying that I love you. Ain't no use in saying that I guess you're leaving soon. I can't go on without you. It's useless.
All these songs are sung by a variety of different voices in the band, but the strongest is Bob Mosley's soulful voice, like on this song.
What is this feeling my heart gets when I see you smile?
Now, Jerry Miller is probably one of the most talented guitarists to come out of that first wave of the San Francisco bands, and that would include guys like Barry Melton, Sam Andrew, James Gurley, John Cipollina, Jorma Kaukonen. Miller was a blues player, and he was a fantastic soloist, and his playing stood out because he never was self-indulgent. It always fit the song, and he never overplayed. Now, what also made him different is that the band Moby Grape didn't do a lot of this acid rock, these type of freakouts that were becoming popular on stage. Moby Grape songs were generally more tight and concise and weren't built for long soloing like you got with some of the other San Francisco acid-style guitar playing. One of the other things that set them apart from the other San Francisco bands is they were rather apolitical, and they didn't embrace the hippie culture, so that made them a bit different. And one of the things that this first album really did is that later on it influenced several other key players like Robert Plant, groups like The Move, and the Black Crowes. Now, this was producer David Rubinson's first band that he really produced from top to bottom. And in an effort to get a bigger vocal sound, he tinkered a little bit with the mixing and put the vocals a little bit out of phase, which didn't work well on the mono version. So you really need to listen to this in stereo. Now, to coincide with the release of the new album, Columbia decided to throw this extravagant launch party. And at this launch party, which was held at the Avalon Ballroom in San Francisco, Moby Grape would play, but all these dignitaries would be invited, including press from Los Angeles in addition to San Francisco. And they would have these wonderful giveaways. And one of the things they did is they had purple balloons everywhere. They had orchids drop from the ceiling like on New Year's Eve. Bottles of wine were given away with the Moby Grape logo on them. There was press kits with bios in there, the kind of Tiger Beat style bios. And then they also had this nice little box with 5 singles in there. So this was originally to be a private only affair, but the doors flung open and word must have got around because it became somewhat of a free-for-all. And even the San Francisco bands came to it, took their box sets and all their gifts and went home. But it was a wonderful party and everything that Columbia wanted it to be. Bob Dylan was even there in the dressing room with the band prior to them going on. And the evening was marred by 3 of the band members getting busted later in the night for consorting with underage girls. Now, this party raised some eyebrows immediately and a little bit in the press because, for hippie bands, this was just screamed hype. And some people called them on it. Columbia was probably putting the cart before the horse here. And some of the things of this party, as history has told it, made it seem kind of a ridiculous affair. One being that the wine bottles that were given out, there was no corkscrews given. Well, one of the myths is that was intended that way because the Avalon Ballroom had no liquor license. Those were intended to be a gift to take home. So the band played to what is estimated at 1,500 people, and the whole event went fairly well, with the exception of the arrest. Now, one of the guys had marijuana on them, so that was considered a felony, so that complicated that a little bit as well. But after the event, the band went right to New York and had a 3-night gig. Now, perhaps the most egregious thing Columbia did was that the 5 singles that were in that fancy purple box, those 5 singles were all released at one time. Now, this is something you just wouldn't do. And I think they were just overexcited and thought that this band was a can't-miss band. The problem is that if you release 5 singles at once, they all compete with one another. And the fact that Columbia didn't designate A-side or B-side on the labels of their 45s would have made it even harder for a DJ to figure out which song is the plug song. Now, there was really only 2 of the songs I think that would have been probably hits on the chart. I don't know that these are #1 songs, but when these were all released, it stunted the chart success of all of them, and only Omaha charted at number 88 on Billboard, doing slightly better in Cashbox. Hey Grandma only charted, bubbled under at number 127, but did manage to get to number 94 in Cashbox. I think that Columbia was thinking, these comparisons to the Beatles, because if you remember 1964, the Beatles had all those songs in the top of the charts. But the Beatles had already had hits with those songs for the most part, in England, and it took a while for them to catch on here. Here, I think they expected all these to just fill the charts, and that just didn't happen. So that was an obvious mistake, and they started to get criticized for this whole launch party, which the underground was very happy to eat off the buffet and take the free gifts. Now they were turning on the band and saying that it's all hype. Now, part of this whole advertising and marketing campaign included print advertisement. So one of the things Columbia did was plaster the band all over Billboard and different trade magazines, outdoor advertising as well. So that was also part of the whole campaign. We'll talk about that a little later. Here is the album. Now, Columbia, for all the money they spent on this party, you think they could have done a little more for this album cover. This was done by a photographer that worked with them all day, and I don't know, he was trying to find the right place, and this antique shop behind it was the place that decided on. I don't think it works that well. It's kind of just a boring band photo. And one of the things that made this difficult is that Don Stevenson is kind of showing the middle finger here. So on the very first pressings, that was left in. Now, this flag here was actually an American flag, and for some reason, I think they thought that somebody flipping the bird with the American flag is not a good combination, but they left this in and made the flag red. There were other pressings of this album where they thought, well, that's like communism red. So they made this black. So here's a reissue of it with the black flag with no finger. And as you notice that this got the track listing on the side here, unlike the first one, which does not. So the photo is cropped a little differently. There's also another version, which I don't have, that has a version that says there's a colored poster inside. So Columbia was continuing to add little tchotchkes to this whole package. So they were spending money making these little changes, and some of these changes probably didn't have to be made at all. Now, the album had only been out 10 days, and we have the Monterey Pop Festival coming up, and they had already invited Moby Grape to participate. And originally, Moby Grape had one of the slots in the Sunday evening program. Now, Monterey was split into really 4 different shows. So it was a Friday evening show, a Saturday afternoon and a Saturday evening show, and then a Sunday evening show. So the choice night was probably Sunday. But with all the bands coming and going, things got shuffled around a little bit, and they were moved to Saturday. Now, there's some 2 different things that went on here. One of the things was that nobody wanted to go first. And Jerry Miller of the band, he volunteered the band to go first. So they played the first slot in the evening show. And what this did, there was about 8 bands per show. All right, so that they had to even it out somehow. So they ended up volunteering just as it was getting dark, and it wasn't a full house at that time, but they ended up playing really well. Now, what happened slightly after the festival, because D.A. Pennebaker was shooting this for his Monterey Pop Festival film. And when Matthew Cates got involved, he demanded big amounts of money. The figure thrown on is $1 million. The whole movie didn't even gross probably $1 million, so that was a ridiculous request. So Moby Grape was not in the film. This kind of led to the misconception that Cates got involved and Moby Grape was intentionally giving a poor time slot. Their time slot was actually quite good. It was the opening slot of that evening show, and they played really well. So no real big issue there, but unfortunately they didn't wind up in the movie. But luckily there was some video shot. Even though the band had a great time at Monterey and played well, they were really upset with their manager for screwing up the film. The album had been out a month, and some of the press did pick up on this hype angle, but generally speaking, that was a minor part of any review. The reviews were glowing. This album was received really well, and the band continued to tour. Perhaps to extend an olive branch to the band after the fiasco of not being able to be in the film for Monterey Pop, the Mamas and the Papas invited Moby Grape to tour with them, along with the Buckinghams. Now, this seemed to be very good exposure for Moby Grape, but Matthew Cates interfered again. The way it was set up was that Moby Grape was supposed to open, followed by the Buckinghams, and then Mamas and Papas were the headliner, obviously. Now, the Buckinghams had a #1 song with kind of a drag, and they had 2 top 10s at the time of this tour, and the new song was Mercy, Mercy, Mercy. So naturally, Moby Grape, who had no hits, was the opener. But Matthew Cates didn't like that. So he had the band show up late and forcing the Buckinghams to start the show, so whereby Moby Grape could play before the Mamas and the Papas. Well, that didn't work out well at all, as the Buckinghams just played longer, and the band ended up mooning the Buckinghams or something, and there was some wacky hijinks going on, so the Buckinghams didn't appreciate that, and it just wasn't maybe the best mix. So that tour wasn't very long, but they got some great exposure, but it just was a bad mix of bands. So as the hype from the launch party died down, Columbia continued its print campaign, which followed the band as it traveled. So you had outdoor advertisements, print ads in Billboard magazine, and things like that. Now, contrary to popular belief, this ad campaign didn't work. But this is simply not true, because even though these 5 singles were released and only 2 got to the lower reaches of the charts, the campaign was working because the album continued to climb up the charts in July and August, peaking at number 24 in September. So how could that album chart so well when there's really no singles to support it? Well, there were singles to support it, and they probably did enough business in these small pockets at least to get the band heard. And the advertisements and the print ads, I suppose, help to push the album as well, because an album doesn't get to number 24 by itself. So hitting number 24 on the album charts to me is what I would call a hit album. So I think those singles did make an impression on some level, and the band was big enough at this time that Jimi Hendrix opened for them. Now eventually the band took a break from touring to get back into the studio and record for what would be their next album. And they were asked to be in the film called Sweet Ride, and they recorded a song specifically for that film. Purportedly, the band never got paid by Cates for their appearance in this film, so that was another sore spot for the band. And throughout October and early November, the band continued to play around the California area. By November, the group headed to New York's Columbia Studios to continue work on their album. And the way it's told is that they were partying too much in California, and sticking them in New York was going to be less of a party for them. Well, the real reason they were in New York is because David Rubinson, the producer, he lived in New York and he wanted to be near his family. So some of the band members didn't care for the fact that they had to leave their families and go record, but what the band did while recording in the New York area was that they gigged around the East Coast during that whole time. Around this time, the band fired Matthew Cates. They tired of his antics. They realized they probably weren't getting the money they deserved, and he was fired on grounds of labor code violations. So that was one positive, at least for the band, that they could rid themselves of him, and they hired Michael Gruber, who they found out of the Rolling Stones camp. With Cates out of the way, the band decided to take some time off from live performances to concentrate on recording tracks for the second album. And one of the things that they were faced with the second album, Rubinson as producer started to add, I guess you would call them, more different studio effects. This was in the wake of Sgt. Pepper, which was the hit of the summer of '67, and a lot of bands took their lead from the Beatles. So that had a lot of studio, I guess you'd say, overdubbing and orchestral stuff. And I don't know if it was Rubinson's idea or Columbia's idea to push the band in a more production-style album like Sgt. Pepper. But that was the decision that was made, and it started to mar some of the recordings, which we'll hear in a moment. Now, the other thing that was decided upon was to add a second disc. That was a jam disc. So this was to be a double album, and this idea of jamming was getting more popular, so I think that Columbia figured that, well, let's kill as many birds as we can here with this album. You know, we'll get the Sgt. Pepper style going. We'll do this jam disc that'll be kind of a bonus disc that'll be free or a discounted rate. So they were going in all these different directions, and the band wasn't really able to put together an album that was as focused as the first. This is the second album. It's called Wow, and the guitar interplay continued on these songs.
They're gonna get better Well, can't you see me? I wanna talk.
Now, in my opinion, Murder in My Heart for the Judge should have been the lead-off single, but Can't Be So Bad got the nod as the single, and it did not chart at all. I had mentioned earlier that the band had played with Buffalo Springfield on several bills, and the song Murder in My Heart for the Judge was an early song that the band was playing live, and Stephen Stills admitted to nicking that melody for the song For What It's Worth.
He said he found himself and gave away the things he called his own.
The prison she's been in and lovers she has seen. Curve, winding, bumping, grinding, motorcycle Irene. Empty smiles, old youth today, and lessons teachers gone away, they say.
Now, those three songs, somewhat mellow ballads, are excellent songs, but compared to the first album, they don't have the energy and the power that those songs have. And one of the problems of the second album is some of the camaraderie between the players was lost as the production took the main stage, where there was more overdubbing, so players were playing their parts separately, much like the Beatles did at Sgt. Pepper, actually. And some of the overproduction could be seen in songs like this.
And what a change. What's that walking through my Will the world keep on spinning? Does it all have to fall?
Even more damage was done to Bob Mosley's highlight song Bitter Wind. This is the first version.
Someday, to those who live or die, man without love is no man at all, but a cold bitter wind passing by. Yes, 'cause a man without love is a no man at all, but a cold bitter wind passing by.
So that second version of Bitter Wind was horribly overproduced, and you even had that freak out section at the end with backwards vocals and all this echo, and it was kind of this music concrete thing that they were trying to do. And compared to the original version, that it was just a shame that they felt that the need to do that. And I think Bob Mosley got talked into that. Again, I don't know whose idea it was, if it was Rubinson's idea. I have a feeling that Columbia may have had a hand in it, because another producer for Columbia, James William Guercio, was doing the same type of thing with the Buckinghams. Now, if you remember the song Susan, that had a similar freak out in a song that didn't need it, that had this kind of music concrete thing, very much like what Rubinson did here. So it seemed like you had two young producers kind of going off the rails, jumping on the Sgt. Pepper bandwagon. Now, another example of the band missing the mark on this album are two Skip Spence songs. One is the 1930s send-up, Just Like Gene Autry, A Foxtrot. Now, with this song, it's kind of a cool song because it's this pastiche of a 1930s song, but on the actual album, you had to switch the speed to 78, which is a pain in the ass. Why would you do that? So you have a gimmick like that on there, and then they've got the other Skip Spence song, Funky Tunk, is kind of a goofy country song.
I would love to love you like I love to do.
Jerry Miller and Bob Mosley show off their blues chops in this last song, and the horns on it just show another example of maybe some more overproduction. So here you've got some odd inclusions in this album, and they finish it off with Naked If I Want To. Now that was a song that they had on the first album, but they did a rock version of it on this album for some strange reason. They had other songs that they could have done, but they decided to repeat a song. So I don't know. To me, these are some of these, what I would call errors in judgment have to fall on the producer's shoulders because he's there to select material and to make a cohesive album. And this album, it's got some great tracks on it, but the track listing is questionable and it doesn't flow together very well. So let's look at another thing that was maybe ill-conceived, the second disc, which was called Grape Jam. Now, this was kind of interesting and maybe a good idea considering the Bloomfield, Stills and Cooper album came out like about 3 months later and was a huge hit. And on this particular record here, the band was not really playing together as much. They were more splintered. Skip Spence's forte wasn't really jamming, nor was Peter Lewis. And Peter Lewis went back home to California during some of these sessions, so he wasn't there. So Mike Bloomfield and Al Cooper did join in on some of these sessions, but even having players on that level didn't really elevate this record to any new heights at all. Now these jams are pretty good, but they're not great. They seem a little bit thin overall. And some people were inspired by this, particularly Led Zeppelin on the song Never, and it was used as the basis for the song Since I've Been Loving You.
Thinking about those bad times, I wish you really knew.
The final song of the Jam album was called The Lake, and the result of this was from a lyric writing contest, and the winner got to write the lyrics to this. So the band had to set it to music, and this is what they did with it.
Where dark currents flow.
Now this Grape Jam was a bit of a directionless exercise, and not all the band members were on board with this. Peter Lewis was back in California for some of the recording of this. He was having some marital problems, and so he was back there trying to keep his marriage afloat. Meanwhile, he was petitioning Terry Melcher, who was a friend of his, to produce Moby Grape. So I don't know if it was feasible for there to be a producer change in the middle of the recording the album, but that suggested that at least one member of the band didn't care for Rubinson's direction. Now, one song the band could have used on this album was a song called Dark Magic, which was their long track. And this was a song that was a Skip Spence song that it was a really good groove. They played it live, and it was discussed recording for possibly the first album, but it seems like they really could have used it for this Jam album, and that could have taken up a whole side. So for some reason, that was not thought of. Now, every California band had their typical long song, which was usually drenched with feedback and all this kind of freak-out type of improvisational playing. But the Grape, the way they approached this song, Dark Magic, was a little bit more nuanced, with the players trading off, riding the groove, and it was a little more of a mellow jam, I think. And there's a couple versions out there that are live that you can find. So overall, this album has some very fine music on it. It's just not executed as well as they could have done it. And what's strange is that this album was a bigger hit than the first album. This got to number 20 in Billboard. So this was a legitimate hit album. Let me explain this to you here. How are these packaged? I think these were packaged combined as separate albums like this, but in the same package. In fact, on my copy here, it says Deluxe 2-record set, but this is crossed out. So at some point, they separated these and sold them separately. Now, you notice that they did not have the logo on the cover here and just went with the artwork. Now, Columbia was still spending money on this band. So the fact that this got to number 20 showed that they were still, I'm sure some of the original singles and all their advertising they were doing were helping, plus the live playing and word of mouth. Now, this whole idea of Sgt. Pepper was very popular. People liked that. So this album somewhat fit into that. It was slightly awkward the way it was produced and executed, but it still fit the sign of the times. Now, this artwork on here was done by Bob Cato, and he was one of the art directors, and it's kind of a surreal image of a Victorian painting, which I think is very cool. The first photo that they had intended to use for this cover, I thought, was not very good, so they wisely chose this instead. Now, there are some different album cover variations on this. For example, the CD version of this has the Moby Grape label on it, and the German album has this as just a double album instead of having it be two separate discs. And the UK version has a different cover entirely. So with two high charting albums to their credit, they started to gain a following with their live playing. Having appeared at Monterey did give them some street cred. So it seems like this whole overhyped thing that everybody talks about nowadays, they seem to have rode out the storm. But what Columbia and fans wanted and inspected disintegrated in a flurry of drugs, deceit, duplicate Moby Grape bands, and the occult, all of which will be thoroughly explained in part 2 of Moby Grape here on Pop Goes the 60s.